tonight's program. Tonight's program opens the program year for the Brookline League of Women Voters. My name is Margaret Bush, and I'm president of our local league. It's interesting for us to note as we come together that the League of Women Voters officially became an organization in February of 1920 out in Chicago. This was just 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified. Now that group could not really take credit for winning the ratification, but that league grew out of an earlier organization. They were descended from the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Today's league, active at the local and state and national levels, is a nonpartisan organization of men and women offering voter services and education. Many of you here tonight are actually members of the Brookline League, and if you're not a member, we hope you'll consider becoming one. There are materials outside on the table for that. Well, the suffragettes could not vote. There were some things they could do. They were allowed to speak, and they were allowed to petition the government. And those rights came to them from way back in 1791 in the US Constitution, in the First Amendment. Tonight's program is going to take up one of those issues that comes up in the First Amendment, that of free speech. Speech has taken on many, many complications over those many years. And the speaker tonight will be talking about that. I'm going to turn this over to Betsy DeWitt. Betsy is vice president of the League of Women Voters, and she will introduce the speaker. There will be a chance, as the speaker concludes, for you to ask questions. So listen up and be ready to have some dialogue with her as she speaks to us. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, and I'd like to say we're very pleased to have Dr. Emily Thorson, Professor of Political Science at Boston College and also a Brookline resident, speaking this evening on a timely topic, fact and falsehood in political rhetoric. The League of Women Voters, as you just heard, was founded on a belief in the power of women and the equality of their political voice. The League fought for women's right to vote and continues to defend, officially, in public, against all efforts to restrict any citizen's right to vote. For nearly 150 years, women have campaigned to be president, from Victoria Woodhull in 1872, Margaret Chase Smith in 1968, and the first African-American, Shirley Chisholm, in 1972. And there have been others. On Monday night, we heard the first presidential debate with the first National Party nominated woman candidate for president in United States history. Achieving this presidential nomination of a major political party is another important milestone in the journey to full democratic equality. During this history-making campaign, we've also heard lots of political rhetoric, some of it not civil. This year, many voters are angry and alienated. We've heard echoes of what political scientist Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics in 1964, and what recent commentator Stephen Colbert said as he explained the difference between truth and truthiness. It just feels like truth. Okay? Dr. Thorson is going to give us a more official view of some of these things. She studied how political information reaches citizens and how purposeful misinformation poses a threat to democratic discourse. She'll discuss how fact-checking organizations and journalists have attempted to cope with misinformation and what research can tell us about the most effective ways of correcting it. We'll also learn what research has to say about how political opinions are formed and how the explosion in the number and variety of information sources and the types of social media influences our individual political decisions. Emily received a dual PhD in Communications and Political Science from the Annenberg School and the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and is currently working on a book that traces how political information and misinformation reaches citizens, and then how this information affects our attitudes and behavior. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Thorson.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you all so much for having me. It's my first year at BC. Well, I just finished up my first year, and my first year as a Brookline resident. And they are both wonderful places to be. So I'm especially happy to come and be talking to you all, especially the League of Women Voters. My mother is a lifelong League of Women Voters member, and I've long since used all of your resources to find information on local candidates and figure out how to vote. So I study, as Betsy said, misinformation, and this is a really good time to be studying misinformation, right? So I get calls from reporters almost every day wanting to talk about the latest crazy thing that a candidate said. So misinformation, bad for democracy, good for me, and for you too, because I have lots of examples to share with you. So I wish I could say I had to search long and hard from last night's debate to find examples of misinformation, but actually I had to turn it on for maybe 5 minutes before I started hearing things that weren't true. So we have some misinformation here from both Secretary Clinton, saying that Donald Trump has paid nothing in taxes, not actually the case, and of course Donald Trump saying, I did not support the war in Iraq, when there is substantial evidence that he indeed did support the war in Iraq. So one of the questions that a lot of reporters ask me is, well, is there more misinformation now than there used to be? And the honest answer is, I don't know, no one knows. Anyone who tells you there is making that up, because we don't have a way of measuring the absolute amount of misinformation that existed in 1920, 1970, 1980 versus today. I can and will talk to you a little bit about how it might affect people differently now than it used to. But it's certainly the case that misinformation has always existed in political discourse. So this is one of my favorite historical examples. This was a picture purported to be of Hitler as a baby. This was published in the Chicago Tribune. It received a lot of attention in 1933. It turns out to actually be a photograph of some poor woman from Ohio's baby. This got doctored up and sent to all the newspapers. This woman came across it and was very startled to see a picture of her child being passed off as one of Adolf Hitler. So, misinformation in the 1930s. More recently, this is one of my favorite pieces of misinformation / conspiracy theory. Sarah Palin, remember her? We thought that was bad, huh? So Sarah Palin had a baby in around 2008, and there is a massive conspiracy about this baby, that it was not actually her baby, but was in fact her daughter's baby, and she was faking her pregnancy to cover up her daughter's pregnancy. So a very salacious piece of misinformation, right? There is an entire book written about this theory, this Sarah Palin conspiracy theory. This was from Moving Forward Yet Again, 2012. Did you know that Oprah Winfrey endorsed Mitt Romney? Well, no, she actually did not. This is a doctored picture. She was at some kind of event honoring women, actually, and some people decided to put her instead in front of a Romney Ryan backdrop and put that out online. So a bunch of different kinds of misinformation here, and jumping forward again to some misinformation that's even more recent, I took this screenshot about a week ago, less than a week, I think. This is a tweet from a Milwaukee sheriff, a very strong conservative Milwaukee sheriff, ostensibly with a quote from Hillary Clinton. saying, look, the average Democrat voter is just plain stupid. They're easy to manipulate. That's the easy part. Hillary Clinton never said this. This is a complete fabrication. And as a professor, I also have to note that it's a grammatically incorrect fabrication in several ways. Like commas should be inside the quotation marks. It's Democratic, not Democrat. So there are a lot of problems with this. But David A. Clark tweeted it. It's still there. I checked right before I came over here. He hasn't retracted it, right? And so this is one of the reasons why misinformation now is potentially more dangerous than misinformation was back in the baby Hitler days, right? Because then people only consumed a few sources of news. So you could be pretty sure that if you're the Chicago Tribune and you accidentally or purposefully publish a piece of misinformation, you can then reach that same audience again by publishing a retraction or a correction a few days later. But now, the media environment is so fragmented that it's really hard to know how to reach people or to correct misinformation or reach the people who have initially seen it, right? What are the chances that David A. Clark is going to actually tweet out a retraction of this? They're pretty small. And then let's imagine that he does. What are the chances that each of the 5,400 people who have retweeted this, that's the updated number from just before this talk, will also tweet out that retraction? Very, very minimal, right? So it's easier for misinformation to spread through Facebook, through Twitter, and through the kind of myriad media sources that we have, and it's much harder to spread than corrections as well, especially given the increasing polarization of news outlets. So that's the bad news. And I'm going to talk about how we actually go about correcting that misinformation given this fragmented media environment in a few minutes. But first I want to kind of take a step back and talk about what do we mean when we say misinformation. So when I say misinformation, I'm talking about false information that's out there in the world. Whether this is something said by Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump or something that your crazy uncle said on Facebook, right? Any of these sources of misinformation, false information that's out there in the world. And misinformation can potentially lead people to hold misperceptions or false beliefs. But it's really important to distinguish between those two, right? Because for one thing, not all misinformation causes misperceptions. You're all probably exposed to misinformation all the time. And you look at the misinformation and you say, well, I don't believe that for a second, right? So just because misinformation is out there doesn't mean that it will cause people to hold misperceptions. And I think some people are better than others at sussing out what misinformation is and figuring out how not to hold misperceptions, right? So the very presence of misinformation is not necessarily as worrisome unless it then causes people to hold misperceptions. And misperceptions can originate without any exposure to misinformation. So an example that I think might be familiar to some of you is the fact that most Americans substantially overestimate the amount of the US budget that goes to foreign aid. When you ask them, they'll estimate, around 25%, 30%. It's actually less than 1%, right? They don't think this because politicians are out there saying we spend 25% of our budget on foreign aid. It's because people aren't very good at estimating numbers, right? A lot of folks are pretty enumerate in some ways. It's not an issue that gets talked about, so they're trying to kind of figure it out for themselves and make these estimates in kind of a vacuum. And actually the book that I'm working on now is really about these types of misperceptions. So misperceptions about public policy that don't necessarily emerge from elite misinformation, but because citizens are kind of trying to fill in the blanks about policy when, as we probably know, the media doesn't always do a great job of covering the ins and outs of policies. They do a much better job of covering the horse race than they do about how Social Security works. So misinformation doesn't necessarily lead to misperceptions. Misperceptions can come from places other than misinformation. But why do we care about misinformation anyway? Why is misinformation kind of a potential threat to democratic functioning? So I think we all have an intuitive sense of why misinformation matters, right? I think when you think about why does misinformation matter, why is it worrisome, then the kind of picture you have in your head is of somebody like this, right? So an undecided voter who is thinking, this is an undecided voter from 2012 who's trying to decide between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. This undecided voter voters kind of weighing their options. I can't really know much about either of the candidates, but then they get an email, maybe from their crazy uncle, talking about how Obama is really a Muslim. And they say, oh man, that's terrible. Well, I guess I'm going to vote for Romney then, because I don't really want someone who's not a Christian in the White House. So this is kind of the worst case scenario of misinformation. It reaches somebody, it causes them to hold a misperception, which in turn causes them to vote differently than they would have otherwise, right? So it's actually changing people's votes, potentially changing people's attitudes. In reality, this is really unlikely to happen. This is a very rare occurrence. And I'm going to tell you why. So in reality, there aren't a lot of people who walk around as blank slates, right? Who just are bumbling around, knowing nothing about politics, not really caring anything about it, who are able to be kind of swung by one piece of misinformation. So we look at who this guy really is, who suddenly believes that Barack Obama is Muslim. Probably he has a party identification. The vast majority of Americans are Republicans or Democrats, even the ones who say they're independent. When you actually go and look at and ask them how they voted, these so-called independents are usually pretty straight-line voters, right? They're going to vote Democratic every time, they're going to vote Republican every time. They just rather call themselves independents. And I'm sure maybe one of you is a true independent, but they're increasingly rare these days. Most people are Republicans or Democrats. So this person goes into this already with a party identification, so with a pre-existing party identity and ideology. And he also probably has some pre-existing policy attitudes, right? So maybe this person doesn't really like Obamacare very much. He just thinks it's the worst. Maybe he also thinks there's death panels, right? So he has a pre-existing party identification. He has a pre-existing ideology. And what that means is that when he encounters this piece of misinformation, that Obama is a Muslim, he's already predisposed to dislike Obama. He's already predisposed to think that it's true. He's already predisposed to be reading the types of news outlets that will have that misinformation in it in the first place. Right? And so this process, the fact that what he believes already is going to affect what he decides to believe is true, has a very important name that I'm going to put in giant fonts because it's so important to how we understand political information and attitude formation, right? This is really one of the key concepts in political science in terms of looking at public opinion and persuasion and attitude change. And this is motivated reasoning, right? So what motivated reasoning means is that whenever we, any of us, approach a new piece of information, right? This could be a yard sign, this could be an article in the Brookline tab, this could be a Facebook post. Whenever we see a new piece of information, we have two competing things going on in our heads. We have two different goals. We have an accuracy goal. We say, well, I want to be correct, right? I want to hold factually correct views. I want to get the right answer. But we also have this other goal that psychologists and political scientists call a directional goal. It means you want to be consistent. Those of you who have taken psychology might kind of think of this as you want to avoid cognitive dissonance, right? You want to avoid things that make you feel uncomfortable. And these goals are always competing in terms of how we process information. And especially in the world of politics, the directional goal often tends to win out. So let me give you an example that's not from politics, because I think that helps to illustrate it a little bit better. How many of you guys are coffee drinkers? How many of you are like coffee drinkers? Like serious? Yes, I have a 6-month-old daughter, so I am a coffee drinker. So when I am just, tooling around the internet, looking at Facebook, looking at Twitter, if I see an article entitled "Drinking Coffee Adds Years to Your Life," you bet I'm going to click on that article, right? Because I probably drink 3-4.5 cups of coffee a day. And that is great news. So I see that article, I click on it, I read it, and then the next time someone gets on my case about how much coffee I drink, I say, well, actually, I just read an article saying that coffee is going to extend my life. So maybe you should have some too. In contrast, if I'm looking around the internet and I see an article that says, headlined, coffee shown to cause heart disease, I don't know if I'm going to click on that, and then if I do, I skim it over and I think, that looks like junk science. I don't think I believe that article, right? Our pre-existing attitudes and are going to affect what information we seek out, so what kind of information we look at in the first place, what media outlets we consume in the first place, what we choose to click on or not click on. Our pre-existing attitudes affect what we believe, so what we decide is true or not true. It affects what we remember. We're more likely to remember things that support the opinions we already have, and we're more likely to use that information to inform our opinion. And you might think, well, that might be true for other people, but not for me. It is true for all of us, right? Whether it's that you are a Patriots fan and you are very particular in what Deflategate articles you read, maybe it's that, maybe it is political, but we all do this. We are not blank slates. We approach information with a lot of pre-existing attitudes and opinions, and those shape what we seek out, what we believe, what we remember, and how we use that information to continue to inform our opinions. So we kind of have this ideal that in an ideal world, in an ideal democracy, people go out, they collect all the facts, they look objectively at those facts, and then they form their opinion based on those facts. And that would be wonderful. That is not how things work. More often than not, especially in the realm of politics, the arrow goes the other way. People have attitudes. They are strong Democrats, they are strong Republicans, they think global warming is a hoax, they think global warming is going to kill us all, and that informs what facts they choose to believe. And this is true when it comes to coffee, when it comes to sports, when it comes to diet, certainly. I don't know if you've ever kind of tried to convince a paleo person that paleo is not that great, but they're huge motivated reasoners, right? Every realm of our life, we engage in this kind of motivated reasoning. And of course, in reality, it's always a little bit more complicated than that, right? Because there are issues that you could care less about. You don't go into them with any pre-existing attitudes. And in those, you're probably not going to engage in a lot of directional motivated reasoning. And some people, obviously, are more likely to engage in this than others, so it does vary. It's not always one direction or the other. But in some, I think if you go back to our person here, what that means is that some of the misinformation that's out there maybe should be a little bit less normatively troubling than it is. We find it really frustrating, I think, as political scientists, people who are interested in politics, when we know something isn't true and people insist on believing it, right? When people just won't let it go about Sarah Palin's fake baby or whatever else, right? It's really frustrating. But when you're laying in bed at night and getting increasingly frustrated about this, just remind yourself of motivated reasoning. Remind yourself that it's not that believing Obama is a Muslim is making people hate him. It's that they already hate him. And so they're choosing to believe these negative things about him. So that's kind of the good news. The bad news is that there are actually a lot of situations in which misinformation does affect attitudes, does cause misperceptions that can alter people's attitudes. Does anybody know who these women are, by any chance? These are two state Senate candidates from, I'm going to get this wrong, something Middlesex, Essex, something. Well, it's one of the few competitive state Senate races in Massachusetts right now, right? There are very few of them. Not yours, so you guys are all off the hook. You don't need to know who these people are. I was going to be really impressed if you could actually pick them out. Probably if the lights were out, you would all recognize them. And this is a really low information race, as most state Senate races are. You don't know a lot about the candidates. Most people are not paying a whole lot of attention. So in these kinds of situations, which we tend to call low-salience races, misinformation can actually make a big difference because there just isn't a lot of other information out there, right? People are less likely to vote with their party identification in these down-ballot races. So when it comes to the presidency, Republicans are pretty much always going to vote Republican, Democrats are going to vote Democratic. But still, there is some side switching when it comes to down-ballot races, right? You do see sometimes people crossing party lines and voting for the other person. So misinformation actually has a much bigger chance of making a difference in these low information races. And for low information issues, right? So misinformation at this point about, let's say, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, probably not going to make a big difference. People's minds are made up on Obamacare. It is great or it is horrible. There's not a lot in between. Right? But if you look at issues, and some other issues, right? So especially trade issues, for instance, that people don't tend to know a lot about, that's an area where misinformation can potentially make a big difference because people don't have a whole lot of pre-existing attitudes about that. So misinformation can make a difference. And which begs the question, all right, well, how do we correct it? What do we actually do? There are two major approaches to correcting misinformation. Fact-checking, so independent fact-checking, and what's generally called journalistic arbitration. So fact-checking has become a really big business. Maybe 50 years ago, there wasn't any such thing as fact-checking, and now you have PolitiFact, you have factcheck.org, you have the Washington Post fact-checker, and you have news outlets doing their own fact-checking, right? So during the debate, many news outlets ran kind of a continuous fact-check alongside the debate. So there's fact-checking, there's kind of these external, right? These are not journalists, these are not newspapers necessarily, these are independent organizations. But then there's also this idea of journalists actually calling candidates out on their lies, or calling politicians out when they say something false. And this is CNN has started doing this sometimes with Donald Trump. So they will actually, this is called Chiron, in this kind of running head down below, call him out when he's saying something that's not true. And you've seen this also start to happen in a couple of other news outlets. Journalists will, in the text of an article, say, actually, this claim is false. It's actually very surprising that journalists are finally doing this because they've resisted doing it for a long time. There's a norm in journalism of objectivity, that you always need to be objective. You're just telling people the facts and telling people what everyone says and then letting them sort it out. Right? This is often referred to as he said, she said journalism. So covering this with he said, she said journalism would consist of, let's say, CNN saying, Donald Trump says Obama is the founder of ISIS. Obama says he's not. Right, that's he said, she said journalism. You're just letting everybody have their say. You're not making any calls. You're just giving people the information and letting them decide. Actually inserting yourself in as a journalist is a pretty big step. And what journalists are worried about, and actually rightly so, is that when they start doing this, then they cease being perceived as objective. That if you are a Trump supporter watching CNN and you see this come on, you say, well, I can't trust CNN anymore. They're inserting themselves into this. They're becoming political. And some of my research shows that that's right, actually. Once journalists start engaging in this kind of journalistic arbitration, they are perceived as less objective. Same with fact checkers, actually. So fact-checking organizations spend a lot of time trying to equally fact-check both sides, even when both sides do not necessarily have the same volume of misinformation, because that will increase the likelihood that they are perceived as objective, which is really important because you want to be perceived as objective so that then people will actually believe what you're saying. So I think it's a really tough choice, both for fact-checkers and even more so for journalists, to decide to insert themselves in this way. So as much as I think some of us are glad to see this happening finally, because of some of these really egregious falsehoods that have been being spread about, there is a cost to this as well, and I think journalists are very aware of. So, all right, let's say we do decide to fact check. How do we make it work best? Like, what's most likely to succeed? And there actually is a fair amount of research on this. So when do fact checks actually succeed in correcting misinformation and causing people to stop holding misperceptions, right? One is, this is good news, with low-salience issues, right? So the less a person is invested in an issue, the more likely they are to believe a fact check about it. So it's really, really hard, again, to convince people that Obama really is a Christian. But it's probably a lot easier to convince them that that misinformation they heard about their state Senate candidate is actually wrong, because they just don't have as much of a dog in that fight. They're not as dug in, so corrections can be a little bit easier. So misinformation can have more of an effect with low salience races and issues, but so can corrections. So that's good news. Second, A paper I just finished looked at kind of adding visual rating scales to fact checks. So I don't know if any of you guys have seen this on PolitiFact, things that say half true, and then it goes all the way over to pants on fire is their worst rating. The Washington Post, Glenn Kessler gives people Pinocchios, so 4 Pinocchios I believe is the most you can get. So including just that additional rating scale makes people more likely to remember and accept the correction, possibly because it just makes it easier for them to process it. And finally, I think this one is really interesting. So some people have experimented on not correcting the Obama is a Muslim myth by saying Obama is not a Muslim, but instead by saying Obama is a Christian, right? And affirmations, so telling people what is true, tends to work a lot better than telling them that that thing is not true. Partly because every time you say that thing is not true, you're still repeating the thing. Right, so you're still kind of digging that into people's minds to some extent. So affirmations, if possible, work better than negations at correcting misperceptions. However, even when misinformation is successfully corrected, right? So even when corrections are 100% successful, people are like, you know what, I believe that correction, that misinformation is definitely wrong, I no longer have a misperception in my head. Some of my research shows that even hearing that misinformation can still affect their attitudes, and I call this belief echoes. So just seeing a piece of misinformation changes your attitude. So those of you who are huge Hillary Clinton supporters, right, you really like Hillary Clinton, you think that she's great, but over the course of this campaign, you've been barraged with so much negative information about her, right? So her trustworthiness, the Benghazi, the email scandals, even if you don't believe any of that misinformation, it still has a subtle effect on how you feel about Hillary Clinton, on average, right? You can't unring that bell of misinformation. You can't completely make those effects disappear. You start to just have a worse feeling about somebody or something when you hear a lot of bad things about them, even if you don't actually believe them. And I can get into the Q&A if you guys would like about kind of why this works, and it has to do with sort of how our brains process information. But what it means is that even when fact-checking organizations correct misinformation, so let's say that you see a piece of misinformation for the first time because PolitiFact tweets it out, that misinformation is going to have a subtle effect on your attitudes, even though PolitiFact is saying that it's wrong. So to some extent, this focus on fact-checking can be a negative because one of the things that it does is it keeps pushing that misinformation out, right? So when you hear all these news outlets yelling about what the candidates said that was wrong, they're still repeating it over and over and over again, and that does have a cumulative effect on attitudes. So what do? This seems like a terrible situation. One potential solution is stopping misinformation at its source, so actually trying to cut misinformation off before it reaches the public. I want to walk you through a really interesting experiment done by Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler where they tried to do just this. And this is a field experiment, so it's not an experiment where people come into a laboratory. It's an experiment that kind of takes place in the real world. So they found 780 state legislators. So these are people who were elected to state houses in a wide range of states, right? And they divided these randomly into 2 groups. Right, well, there's Teddy Roosevelt here. Anyone know who this guy is? Yeah, Hoover. Hoover we trusted. Yeah, so Roosevelt and Hoover, well, they'll just stand in for our groups because one group got a letter, much like this nice letter that Teddy here is reading. The other group did not get a letter. That letter said, hey, just so you know, fact-checking organizations are watching what you say and could potentially fact-check you at any time. We just wanted you to know that. Have a great year. Right? The people who didn't get a letter, fact-checking organizations were watching them too. Right? So they were still under view by these fact-checking organizations, but they just didn't get a letter telling them that. So then, they waited about 6 months, and during that time, looked at how many of these politicians' statements were checked by PolitiFact. right? Because PolitiFact actually has a lot of state affiliates that focus on these down ballot kind of state legislative races and elections. So remember, there's two groups. One group, half of them were randomly assigned to get a letter. One group is randomly assigned to not get any letter. So they looked at how many of their statements were checked. And what they found was that the people who got the letter were both less likely to be checked in the first place, and second, less likely to be called out for making false claims. And keep in mind, PolitiFact did not know which of these people got the letter, right? So they had no idea who got the letter. This is behavior. Politicians changed their behavior because they were concerned about potentially being fact-checked. So this suggests that we can try to kind of cut misinformation off at the source. So I'm going to conclude by kind of doing the bad news and the good news. So I am a hip college professor, so I can use the emoji, right? This is what the kids are doing. This is a sad face emoji, and so this is all the sad things about misinformation. There's a lot of it, right? I can't promise you there's more of it than there used to be, but there's a lot of it. Motivated reasoning makes it really difficult to correct misinformation, right? You guys have all had, I'm sure, visceral experiences with this, probably over the Thanksgiving dinner table, where you just keep yelling at people that no, that's not right, why don't you look at the evidence, and they just refuse to. That's motivated reasoning right there. And these belief echoes exist. So even when you do finally manage to get through to them and correct that misinformation, it still continues to have these trickle-down effects on their attitudes, even without them necessarily being conscious of it. But the good news, right? Motivated reasoning also means that most of this misinformation isn't actually changing people's attitudes. Their attitudes are what's causing them to believe this misinformation in the first place. So it's not having this horrible effect of kind of making people vote for candidates they would not otherwise vote for. And fact-checking works for a lot of issues, especially low-salience issues, especially the issues that misinformation is most likely to make a difference for. So that's also good news. Fact-checking can change politicians' behaviors, and some experiments that I've done have looked at what happens when a politician is fact-checked. Do people actually like them less when they're fact-checked? And the answer is yes, even when it's a member of your own party. So if I'm a Republican and I see that my Republican senator has been fact-checked and found to be lying, I'm going to like him a little bit less. So yes, fact-checking does make people like politicians a little bit less. They are punished for lying.
Unless they're Donald Trump.
No, Donald Trump is we can talk about this in the Q&A, but there's a reason that he is the least liked candidate in history, right? People tend to say everything just bounces off of him. It doesn't. People really dislike Donald Trump. Even a lot of the people who are supporting him actually don't like Donald Trump very much. So yes, it does make a difference. It doesn't necessarily make a difference so that they won't vote for him, but it does make a difference in attitudes. So as you can see, this quantitative analysis, 3, 4, 4 is greater than 3, so therefore my outlook is optimistic about the future of misinformation in politics. So thank you very much. Thank you to League of Women for inviting me. Thank you to the library for hosting us here. And also, you're welcome to check out my Twitter account. My website has some more of my research, and I am happy to take any questions you guys have. Also about, I know I didn't talk much about kind of gender in misinformation or kind of women in politics, but I'm happy to take questions about that as well. Yeah.
I was curious, like, when you talk about fact-checking, and first of all, that was very interesting, thank you. What if the fact-checker is wrong? Like, for example, Gary Johnson talked about Aleppo, but then the New York Times did 2 corrections where they didn't know the difference between Damascus and, so bottom line, they and their urge, shall we say, to fact-check, didn't know the geography of Syria themselves. So how does that impact things, and the fact that he's a third-party candidate? Like, if the fact-checker is wrong, is that perceived as bias by the paper and seen as they're more liberal or conservative?
Well, first of all, probably most people don't know enough to know that the fact checker is wrong, and so there's, I mean,
sorry.
I would imagine. I mean, that's my sense.
Sorry. Okay.
Oh no, it's a great question.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. But in general, I think that it would, if you noticed that a fact checker was consistently getting facts wrong, that would probably make you trust them a lot less and probably not go to them in the future. So I would say that it's a fragile relationship that fact checkers hold with their audiences, and so something like that could potentially be.
That was like the New York Times, which is highly regarded.
Exactly, yeah. I think that could be potentially really damaging to them and people's trust in them. Yes.
Two short questions.
I'm going to stop you just for a second. If you speak into the mic, it will get recorded. And the mic is to be recorded.
I watched Monday night's debate, so-called debate, on CNN. So I know that they didn't have CNN, at least on that occasion, didn't have a marginal crawl or whatever, fact-checking. And I know that there were at least a dozen different stations, I think, broadcasting the debate. So I'm wondering, for the other debates, if I want to see it, if I want to have it fact-checked along at the same time as I'm watching it, what station would you recommend I go to? My other quick question is, I wonder if you have any, I'm wondering where on earth the Trump voters are getting their news from. I wonder if you have any source information, any figures about, I know 50 years ago, everybody read newspapers, and or at least there were 3 major networks, and now it's all fragmented. I wonder if you have any figures about which different sources large numbers of people are relying on to get their news. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first question, where do I see a debate live fact-checked? Unfortunately, I think the fact-checking monkeys can't type fast enough to keep up with all of the lies, so I would recommend maybe recording the debate and watching it the next day once the fact-checkers have had time to do their work. But it would be amazing if you actually could have real-time fact-checking. I think it's just a practicality. It would just be hard to actually do that quickly. But
I don't know of anybody doing it.
no, I mean, I think if you look at, I know NPR had a kind of constantly updated stream on their website but it wasn't scrolling across the bottom of the TV screen, but NPR had a constantly updated. Vox also has a constantly updated list of what they're fact checking. So I think it requires some dual screening. You have to have a laptop and your TV if you want to do that. The second question about where people get their media from is a good question. The major effect of the explosion of choice in media, like you said, there used to be 3 channels. Everybody used to watch the news because the news was the only thing on when you turned on the TV at 6:30 p.m. Now you can watch Animal Planet, you can watch BMX bike racing, you can watch anything you want, and what that means is that a lot of people just don't watch the news at all. So there are large numbers of Americans who just are not following this election one bit. And I think it's really hard for us who live and breathe politics to internalize that, but it's true. Most people just don't care that much and are kind of just tuning in now, right? They didn't bother voting in the primary, they haven't really been paying much attention, and maybe they started clicking in on the debates, right? They're just starting to kind of figure out what's happening here. And in some ways it doesn't matter because the vast majority of them are just going to vote their party line anyway. So what we're interested in is those very few people who kind of teeter between the parties and what are they doing right now. And insofar as those people do consume news, local TV news is still a huge source of news for most people, which doesn't tend to have a lot of national political coverage, and what they do is not very substantive. And I think a lot of people use just kind of Yahoo News or whatever sort of pops up on their search engine. Most people are not news seekers. The good news is most people are not watching partisan news either, right? I think there's this myth out there that Democrats are all watching MSNBC and Republicans are all watching Fox. First of all, most people just don't watch cable news at all. Second of all, people who do watch cable news watch other kinds of news too. Most Fox News viewers actually have a very diverse media diet. They're also reading newspapers. They're people who care a lot about the news. They watch a lot of Fox News also, but few people who care enough about politics to opt into partisan news are then only watching partisan news. I mean, if you think about yourselves, right, you might watch partisan news, but you're not only going to watch that. You maybe watch that because it makes you feel good, and then you watch a bunch of other stuff as well. So the answer is most people are not paying much attention at all as far as they do mostly TV news.
Well, this is probably redundant because it continues what just Justin was saying. My question is, what does an average voter, how do we find, there's no analysis. Sure, we have CNN and Fox and so on, but it's 24/7 reporting of the horse race. There's no analysis. So even when, unless you read all that, and read the editorial page every day, that's still there's no place to get an analysis. You're just listening to what he said, she said. Even when they're reporting the debate, it's just analysis of what they said at that particular time. There's no analysis of the issues. I don't know where, well, certain PBS, the news.
Yeah, I share your frustration.
It's hard.
Yeah.
And certainly for the average person who works, two-worker family who work, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, they come home, they don't have time to read the newspapers from one day to the next, and the only time they have is probably half an hour every day. So where do they get their information? I don't know. I didn't tell them.
It's really tough, right? There's a huge incentive for journalists to just focus on the horse race and not focus on substantive policy issues. Partially because the people who read the news a lot, that's what they click on, right? They'll click on horse race stuff. They won't click on something that says, here's how the candidates differ in their trade policies, even though that's ideally what people should need to know. In terms of a practical recommendation, so there's a new breed of kind of explainer news sites. So there are some journalists who I think share your frustration with this. Vox.com is a really good one. So they do a lot of kind of backgrounders on policy issues and kind of what the candidates' plans actually are that I found pretty helpful. So in general, looking for kind of explainer news is the term I think you're looking for, and it would be great if there were more of that. And I'm somewhat hopeful that as things go more online, that actually might increase, because one of the constraints for news organizations for a long time is what can you actually fit on the page, and they don't have that constraint anymore. So when that starts happening, the hope is that some of this content, this more explanatory content, it's not necessarily breaking news, but it is important background information for people to know, will get a little bit more attention.
So, Becky, this is a really interesting talk, and you left the door open, and I'm going to walk through it. That it's been widely reported that the male candidate in this race is wide support from white males, and so I wonder really what the effect of gender is on this race, and if that's been able to be sort of teased out of all the data that we've been getting.
Yeah, and certainly this is the biggest gender gap that we've ever seen. It is impossible to tell whether that's because women really like Hillary Clinton or because women really hate Donald Trump, or whether it's a combination of both. But it is certainly, and it's also hard to say to what extent Trump support is driven by people who really dislike Hillary Clinton, right? I think we will know more about this down the road when we have more time to look at the data and to kind of really dig through these polls and start to figure out motivations. I will say that in general, gender does not tend to be the deciding factor for people's votes. It can influence kind of how people vote, but party is just so important. You can't, when you're talking about political science, you're talking about politics, nothing trumps party, right? Party identification is so strong. But that, I think, one of the reasons why Trump has been so successful is not because, more recently at least, is not because of who he is or what he's saying. It's because he's a Republican, and Republicans will vote for Republicans. And I think if most Democrats were honest with themselves, they would say that even if a man dressed as a chicken ran for the Democratic nomination, we'd be like, well, chickens have a lot of important things to say. We should probably vote for that chicken. People are very loyal to their party because it's become part of our identity. It's become part of who we are, and it's really difficult for people to leave their party and to cross party lines and vote for somebody else, especially in the presidential election. And yes, there are obviously a lot of people out there who are, he is the best thing ever. There are also a lot of Republicans out there who are pretty uncomfortable with Donald Trump that are voting for him anyway because he is a Republican and they have voted Republican their whole life. So I think, again, gender matters, party matters a lot more. So I'm not saying that there is not some cases where gender is kind of the deciding factor in how people are voting, but I think that that's fairly rare.
I have a couple of questions related to lying, which I know is a particular form of misinformation. And I'll just start by observing that lying in politics is not particularly new. Politicians have been lying and lying with great success for a long time. In Germany, the Nazi Party built its whole propaganda strategy on the concept of the big lie, whether it was that the Jews had caused Germany to lose World War I, or that the communists had burned the Reichstag. And it worked very well for them. And it's not just the Nazis. You can find lots of examples in American history. I'm thinking of Lyndon Johnson in particular, who was a politician who had great success. And there's a famous anecdote that he said to his campaign team to accuse my opponent of fornicating with pigs. And they were shocked. And they said, he's never going to admit that. And Lyndon said, I don't want him to admit it. I just want to see him deny it. He understood the echo effect that you talked about before. So I have two questions based on this long-standing tradition, unfortunately affected lying. We look at the current situation and we wring our hands and say there's so much misinformation. But has it really gotten worse or better? Is it now easier for politicians to succeed by lying, or has it gotten harder? And looking ahead, given that we already have a lot of fact-checking, what would you recommend as further steps that would make it harder for politicians to successfully lie their way into office in the future?
Has it gotten worse? Again, I don't know, right? I don't know if the absolute volume of misinformation has increased in the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I don't, there isn't a measure of
Well,
that.
my question wasn't about the volume, but just about the efficacy.
Oh, the
Does lying work more now or less now than it used to say
Good
Lyndon
question.
Johnson?
Again, I hate to keep going back to party, but I kind of have to because it's so important in how people make up their minds, right? When we say matter, right, or is effective, I think what often we're implicitly saying is it winning them the election? Is it what is causing them to win? If they had not lied, would they not have won, sort of? And so much of who wins and who loses is determined by what the partisan distribution of the electorate is at any given time, right? I mean, when I was looking for a state senate race in Massachusetts as an example to put up there, there's what, 4 competitive state senate races in Massachusetts? I mean, it's unbelievable, right? Between kind of the incumbency advantage, gerrymandering, redistricting, everything else, most elections are decided, and party decides almost everything. So I think, and that did not used to be the case, right? It used to be that people crossed party lines all the time, that party ID was not as consistent a predictor of how you were going to vote. And I think in those days, there was a lot more wiggle room for anything a candidate said to actually make a difference, right? Because it wasn't all about party identification. People's votes couldn't be explained just by their party. Now, when party explains so much, any additional piece of information is less likely to make a difference. So I think lying is, to that extent, probably less effective now than it used to be, but that's because all information is less effective now than it used to be. And in terms of what we can actually do, I think that certainly making politicians aware of what's happening is a good idea. So my research, the next stage of my research is really focused on partially what you were saying about giving people more of this kind of policy background. And I think making people feel more competent in navigating politics and giving people more of this important kind of background information will hopefully make them less subject to misinformation and feel more capable of resisting misinformation, right? So increasing their accuracy motivation as opposed to the directional motivation, et cetera.
Back to the media question, I prefer public television and I watch the news regularly, but I'm wondering how much of a percentage does public television get as opposed to other broadcast, regular channels?
Don't have a number, but I can make an estimate, and it is tiny. The estimate is this big. CBS are the main TV outlets. I mean, I think the world would be a better place if we all watch more public TV, but we do not live in that world.
I like public TV too.
I think most of the public TV audience in Brookline is probably in this room right now.
My question is physicalities, during the debate, physicalities of the opponents. How much does that sway voters, do you think?
So how the candidates move.
Smiling.
Yeah. I think it can, I think with any of this, with misinformation, with physicality, with anything people say, it's going to be more, it's going to make a bigger difference if it plays into a narrative that already exists. So, insofar as there are, right, so Donald Trump, for instance, has tried really hard to create this narrative that Hillary Clinton is fragile, that she's sick, that, she's not kind of fit to be president, like physically fit. And so I think one of the things that she really had to do during the debate was to seem confident and fit, right? So if she had stumbled, if she had coughed, that would have played really poorly for her, versus another candidate up there, it wouldn't matter at all if they did that, because that didn't play into a pre-existing narrative about them. Similarly for Trump, right, the Clinton campaign has been pushing this narrative that he is, temperamental and, has on a short fuse, and so his kind of stuttering and blowing up reinforced that narrative and kind of played into that as well. So I think physicality can matter to the extent that it reinforces the existing beliefs that people already have about these candidates.
I'm just really curious about the statement that people attributed
In the microphone.
We just have to sort of shout it.
I'm just really curious to know about how it was learned that the statement that people said that she made isn't true.
Which one?
The one that was up on.
Oh, the very first one?
Yeah.
I think that particular one that he hasn't paid any taxes, like he has IRS records from a couple of years showing that he didn't pay taxes. So.
No, I meant the one with the tweet.
Oh, that she didn't say that? It was sourced. It said it's in this book, and then you go and look at the book, and when you go and look at the book, it's just not in there. So that was a pretty easy one, I think. I mean, I guess she could have said that like quietly to herself in the mirror one day, and we would not know if it was true or not. But certainly, where it says that it was, which is in this book, it was not actually.
Yes, concerning your statement in the beginning that Hillary Clinton said that Donald Trump hadn't paid taxes, what she actually said was a lot more nuanced than that. And I take exception to the way you said it, that sounded as though she said that Donald Trump simply hadn't paid taxes. She said that on the 2 tax returns that he did make public, he hadn't paid taxes, and the rest we don't know, and maybe that's why he won't make them public.
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem with a lot of this fact checking is that and that's a problem that a lot of people have with fact checking organizations more generally is that they do take things out of context. I mean, you could say the exact same thing about the Trump quote, right? Or about Trump's opposition to the war in Iraq, or his supposed opposition to the war in Iraq. No, he never came right out and said, hey everybody, let's invade Iraq, I think it's the best idea ever. He said a lot of things that I think would be interpreted by a rational person as saying that he supported the war. But no, he did not ever come right out and say explicitly, yes, I support it. And so calling something true or untrue, or calling somebody out without context, certainly, I think is a danger for a lot of these fact-checking organizations. And I don't think we have the right answer except to, what I always recommend to people is don't focus too much on any individual fact and look at the aggregate. Try to kind of average over, if you're trying to look at fact-checking between candidates, look in general how many statements have been fact-checked by them, how many statements have been fact-checked by their opponent, are they true, are they not true, as opposed to focusing too much on any individual one.
My question builds on what you had said about people who have voted a particular way continue to vote that way. But with the realization there are a lot of new voters, young voters, newly naturalized citizens, people who haven't fallen in that pattern. And if we want to hold a discussion, but we don't want to generate the belief echoes, I like the example you gave of an affirmative statement rather than repeating the false statement. It's useful to have a pattern to say, okay, that's a way to carry on the conversation. Do you have any more examples like that?
Oh man, it's actually really, so I always use that example because it's very straightforward, but I recently tried to design an experiment where I was looking at kind of affirmative corrections versus negations. It turns out that it's actually hard, right? So it's let's take a piece of misinformation about, this candidate accepted illegal campaign donations, right? So candidate Sharon something or other accepted illegal campaign donations, right? But let's say she didn't actually. What's the affirmative of that? Sharon got all of her donations legally. Well, you don't want to say that, and that sounds like something sketchy is going on, right? So I think it really depends on the individual piece of misinformation that you're trying to figure out the affirmation for. Unfortunately, there is not one hard and fast rule of here's how you do the affirmative version versus the negation. But I think in general, trying to say the good things about the candidate rather than just negating the bad things. So maybe it's not directly saying, oh no, she never received a legal donation. Say, look at, she's got a lot of small dollar donations, and overall her donations have been, from a wide range of people in the district, something like that.
My own personal perception is that if Donald Trump wins, he will have proven overwhelmingly that you can say anything you want. And I am wondering, is there ever any punishment for someone who says anything they want and get in? I mean, will the fact checkers keep going? And particularly since you say we tend to vote on our own party line, we'll believe anything we're told, it seems to me. But it seems to me that he is egregious in just saying what he feels like saying, and no one seems to slack him down.
Yeah, I agree. This is my greatest fear about this election is not so much that Donald Trump will win. I mean, that is terrifying, but what is the lesson that sends to every other politician? That whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it says you can say whatever you want. It doesn't have to be true, it doesn't have to be polite, it doesn't have to be anything else, and your party will line up behind you and vote for you regardless. Right, and that is pretty terrifying, I think, because up until now, there's been this kind of veneer of civility, right? Like we've all been, it turns out, pretending that really you had to obey these certain rules of politics in order to get elected, and I think that he's kind of shown the lie to a lot of that actually party identification is so strong that you really can do all of this. And maybe it won't be for everybody, maybe it won't be for every race, and maybe maybe somebody will try to do that in a Senate campaign and get slapped down, right? I don't know how it'll actually play out, but I agree. I think that's really troubling.
What I'd like to know is when does a lie become defamation of character? When does a lie, you can be sued for defamation of character? I know it's very hard to prove, but it would seem to me if that's what a politician is doing, saying a lot of lies about another person, you're also defaming them. So do you have any idea about the law?
I don't offhand, although I know it's really hard to win defamation suits in the United States. If you can take it to England, they're much likelier to win a defamation suit in the UK, but I mean, once you are a public figure, it's very, very difficult to make a compelling argument in court that something is defamation. If you're a private citizen, maybe, but once you enter into the realm of politics, that protection mostly drops away.
Okay, do we have...
But I'm not a lawyer, so don't go defaming anybody and then telling them that I said it was okay.
So, I think we've had a very interesting and informative conversation here with Dr. Thorson, and I frankly have had a number of questions answered and an equal number of questions that I'm now going to have to think about more. But my takeaway, at least, has been be careful what you repeat, because you may be reinforcing. And it's got to do with the people you're in favor of or the people you're opposed to. But it seems to me that a very strong message here is you just add to the numbers, so to speak, of how should I say? You add to the level of information that people keep if what you do is repeated. So be careful what you talk about. Anyway, I'm going to turn this back over to our president.
All right, I'm going to stay down here. A very big thanks to Emily. Most especially to all of you who asked questions and entered into this conversation with her. That was really wonderful to have her sharing all of that back with us. Thank you also to all of the various members of our lead board who set up our table outside to greet you and who set up the refreshment table to feed you. We would like to remind you that we have some upcoming programs as well. First of all, the Brookline League, every month on the second Friday of the month, has a nice informal coffee gathering at Panera's. And any of you are welcome to join us. The October meeting will be on Friday, October 14th at 9:30 a.m. for coffee. We generally pick a topic that we're going to talk about, and the topic, as we move toward the election, is going to be two of the state ballot questions. The question on farm animals and the question on charter schools, which people have lots of different feelings about that. But also in October, on Wednesday, October 19th, we will be holding another program in this room in which a speaker from the State League of Women Voters will be with us to talk about both sides of all four of the state ballot questions. Because there's a big television program later in the evening, that program here in this room will begin just a little bit earlier, so it's going to be at 6 o'clock on October 19th. So we hope that some of you might want to join us, if not in October, some other month for coffee. It's fun to get acquainted with you. And then we hope that all of you will consider coming back to this room on October 19th. For that particular program. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at other times this year.